It's about history, policy, and impact. A new perspective on current affairs, bringing experience, insight, civility, and scholarship to the urgent issues of today. It's about our past, present, and future. Your host, Pulitzer Prize-winning author and journalist, Douglas Blackman. From the University of Virginia's Miller Center, this is American Forum.
Welcome back to American Forum. I'm Doug Blackman. Whose fault was Ferguson? That's the question beneath almost all of the debate in which Americans have been engaged over the past year after a young black man was killed during an encounter with a white police officer in Ferguson, Missouri. The long string of similar confrontations since then, and in so many places, the demonstrations and at times riotous behavior by African Americans and others in protest of those events. Whose fault is it? Should someone be punished? Can anything be done to prevent these incidents from continuing in American life? Those are the questions for which we have all been fumbling for answers, and the focus of our American Forum special series, continuing in this episode, asking, what now? Where do we go from here? Our guest today has been one of the most influential and widely followed scholars on Black life in America for more than 4 decades. Orlando Patterson is a professor at Harvard University, the author of many acclaimed volumes, winner of the National Book Award, a prolific commentator, and an extraordinary and often outspoken public intellectual. He's also the editor and a major contributor to the recently published The Cultural Matrix, Understanding Black Youth. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So, Ferguson, Baltimore, all of the incidents and the debate that we've had in the country over the past year, what's your broad view about what has happened here and the state of the conversation in America about race?
Well, I think you have to distinguish between proximate, immediate causes or faults, if you want to call it that, and more basic, fundamental ones. There's no problem, no doubt about what the immediate fault was. A very incompetent, out of control police in many areas of the country. The killing of the black youth in Ferguson and in South Carolina, and more recently in Baltimore, clearly indicates bad policing, possibly influenced by racist attitudes, although I don't want to sort of claim that all policemen are racist. That's certainly not the case. I think, as a policeman wrote me in response to an op-ed I did, a very interesting letter just yesterday. I think the police are typical in terms of the number of people who are racist and who are not. But what I emphasize is very badly trained police and a police culture that has emerged in recent years with our strong punitive emphasis or over-incarceration and so on, which has shifted from seeing violence as a last resort. As a professionally trained policeman, you should recognize that your job is to constrain without resorting to killing. That comes as a last resort. In fact, what has happened in recent years is that shooting to kill is the first resort. Now, that's what you do in the military. That's not what you do in the police force, because you're dealing with citizens, not enemy combatants. Unfortunately, a mentality has emerged in which this is a commonplace. So that's the immediate proximate cause. How did we get into this situation? That's the next question. And why do the police find themselves in a situation where they have to exercise ultimate restraint so often? And that gets into the deeper issues. And it's only partially involved with race, to the degree that most of the problems between blacks and white Americans go back to a long history, and institutional racism, as it's called, and so on. That certainly is a factor. But the deeper issue is not one of increasing resurgent racism, as several of the race leaders and others have commented on recently. I want to emphasize here, in fact, that America has seen tremendous progress in racial attitudes since the Civil Rights Revolution. And all our surveys, as well as very close-up, in-depth interviews, indicates that that trend hasn't changed. The white population continues to be increasingly liberal in its attitudes. You know, compare now with as late as the 60s, when the majority of white Americans thought that blacks were inferior and wouldn't want to live near them and so on, to one in which the great majority do not hold such views. And I want to especially emphasize one interesting thing about American racial attitudes. The younger generation of Americans, the millennial population, even people under 35 or so, are easily the most racially tolerant group of Caucasians anywhere in the world. The problem is not research into racism, and we don't need a national conversation on race.
So let's go back over that just for a second, what we were just discussing. You were recently quoted saying that you're not interested in a national conversation on race. Yeah. So why did you agree to come on this show where we're having a conversation on race?
No, we're having a conversation on the recent troubles, the problem of police violence and the reaction to that violence by black Americans, quite rightly, and the discussion of as a result of this, of the condition of African Americans, and but more specifically, of violence, and both by the police and in the black community. That's what I feel we need a national conversation on. The conversation on race generally is simply too vague and misses the point. It's a waste of time having a national conversation on race. You know, you're going to have white folks saying, I'm not racist, and denying this and getting resentful, and blacks saying, yes, it's racist. Well, that doesn't get it. What do you do with that? Bill Clinton tried that. It didn't work. What we need is a conversation on our police force, how we go about dealing with our citizens as policemen, and we need to understand what's happening in the inner cities and why the police are there so often. And that leads us into complexities which some people may not want to face, but which I think we have to face.
I think you're getting at the same frustration or emptiness that I was feeling when I first decided, let's try to do a series of these episodes that have this kind of conversation, because my sense was immediately after Ferguson and the first round of protests and the conversation then, that it was so repetitive, that this was the same sequence of events, the same conversation we've seen after Trayvon Martin, after all sorts of things. They go back and you begin to forget all of the times that we've had a version of this, and everyone gravitating to scripts that they've played out many times before, quite sincere, knowing how to be mad at each other, knowing how to proclaim that things are bad, but nothing ever really seeming to go beyond that point in the conversation.
What I'm saying is that you have a rather difficult situation where most whites can say, I'm not a racist, and most blacks can say, they're racist all around the place. So, but overall, my own view, and I speak here more as a foreigner, if you like, I see myself as an American now. I came here 40 years ago. I see myself also as an African American. What impresses me is looking both over time, the fact that the situation has gotten so much better. It's hard to imagine America now during the Jim Crow era, but it's within my lifetime. So I tend to prefer to see the good, the glass half full or 3/4 full rather than a quarter empty. So but also, since I work a lot with younger Americans as a professor, I also see disproportionately the remarkable changes that have taken place. This younger generation of Caucasian Americans are exceptional in their attitudes. I also do something else, which I think is important when thinking of America, and we can move away from this now, is to compare America with other countries. Europe is largely untested. It's okay for Sweden to say, gee, we're remarkably sort of liberal, until you're tested. And France, look at what's happening there now. What I'm saying is that if you compare America with other countries, we're still way ahead. And especially if we compare America with Brazil, which has the largest black population in the world outside of Africa, and much larger, twice the size of the black American population. We're just way ahead of them in terms of the advances made by Black Americans, and so on.
Yeah,
so that, I think one should place that in context before we get to what is a racial problem and a problem of policing and a problem of violence, which we can get to. That's the issue we want to talk about.
And that's an incredibly important point that you make. The United States, and it's not just to make Americans feel better in the midst of a difficult time, but it's very true that most Americans don't realize that until very, very recently, most European countries still had blood citizenship. And so the non-white people living in Germany, for instance, until quite recently, mostly Turks and other minorities had almost no prospect of ever becoming citizens of a country like that.
It's not just that. I look at Japan
Yeah.
and its Korean minority. Fourth generation Koreans are still not recognized. And concerned Japanese parents will hire investigators to check out whom their daughter is marrying. And if there's even a whiff of being a Korean, that's the end of it.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's an important point that that in the midst of all this, that things have improved in many, many ways. But you and this most recent work and the body of your work over time, you're also at the very center of a quite important debate among scholars, and that has a reflection in the larger political and policy debates as well. And that is this disagreement that boils down to, in sociological terms, as of that. Are the problems that face the country now in terms of race, is it about structure or is it about culture? Is it this persistent legacy of the past embodied in the bank lending practices and discriminatory hiring practices and the way the government behaves? Or is it something about the behavior of African Americans and the cultural matrix, the milieu that they live in?
I never talk about culture in isolation, although I emphasize culture because it's been de-emphasized. I always see culture as interacting with social and economic factors. But yes, it was necessary for someone to emphasize that that history matters. And you as a historian would know what I mean. And it may surprise you that that one should emphasize that history matters, especially in a place like Virginia where history is all around you. You can't step outside this building without seeing history everywhere. One of the curious things about Americans, though, is that while happy to emphasize history where history glorifies, there's usually a reluctance to emphasize history where history emphasizes the not so glorified features of American past. Slavery, which took up a good chunk of our history, and the neo-slavery system, which you've written so wonderfully about, so penetratingly about, that persisted right to the 40s. You can't write that off. This is very important. America then is distinctive in being the only European-derived country in which slavery existed in the society. You see, Britain had slavery. They introduced it. So did France and so on. Well, it was thousands of miles away from Britain or France and so on. It was here in America. And this is an important feature in American society. Starting here in Virginia, slavery then and all its consequences became constitutive in many fascinating ways. And one, of course, is the development of racism to justify this harsh treatment of African Americans. But there are the cultural implications of slavery. Several of them which went beyond just racism and the belief that blacks are different. It's the idea of what I call natal alienation, the fact that blacks do not belong. That's true of all slave societies, by the way. You define a slave as someone who doesn't belong to the society because they belong to someone else. When the institution was abolished, legally, the culture of slavery persisted. And as you've pointed out, it even persisted in some legal respects too. But more importantly, the idea of the group not belonging was an important feature of that. And there are lingering elements of it even in the attitude towards Obama. It's the fact that what people are focused on is the fact is his birth, you know. And so that's one element of the society which persists. So within the culture of the dominant group. And when I speak about culture, I speak of it on both sides, okay? the exclusion of blacks as full members of the society. It persists also in what I think is one of the biggest problems that African Americans face, and which is a relic of the past, which is segregation. Blacks are almost as segregated now as they were when Martin Luther spoke against it, who emphasized, of course, just this. When he talked about the beloved community, he was talking about integration. Integration in our schools, integration in our societies. Now, so the other question, of course, is what did this long history do, not just the whites and their attitudes in terms of racism, excluding blacks, but the blacks? People don't like to talk about this, and but we have to, because there were both positive and negative consequences of that history. The positive side of the resilience, the remarkable culture which African Americans, in spite of all the oppression, were able to develop, a culture which greatly informed the national culture. So people don't seem to recognize that. One of the things we emphasized in the cultural matrix was the extraordinary effect of the black minority on the general culture, not just the popular culture in sports, music, arts, drama, fashion, and so on, but the elite culture in jazz, which is our classical music, and in ballet, and so on. And one of the great paradoxes of the black minority is the great integration culturally in the society, accompanied by the unusual level of exclusion socially. Social exclusion and cultural integration. It's quite remarkable. You see it every time you turn on your television. And you see it in the fact that the national mother confessor is a black woman, Oprah Winfrey. And you see it in the astonishing sort of reverence for black athletes and so on. But then you get the same reverence accompanied by exclusion socially. It's one of the great puzzles of our American life.
Much of what you've just been describing in terms of the cultural argument,
yes,
is still in the general category of, arguably, things that African Americans are not necessarily in control of. That the sort of the creation of a segregated world in which African Americans are separated, and then the impact of that, and to some degree, that's something that there's being imposed on African Americans.
Yeah.
But much of what you argue about has to do with the other side, that African Americans also are not doing what they should do in some respects.
Okay, so let's get to that. I wanted to emphasize, culture is complex. I mean, but you explained it very nicely. There are the consequences of what's done to people. What originates a problem? What initiates a problem? Is not necessarily what continues to be the factor primarily explaining its persistence. And people often say to me, but why is it that the number of single-parent families increased so substantially after the 60s? That could not have to do with slavery. And I said, no, that's a silly argument, because to say that something initiates a process is not to say that other factors do not then reinforce it. And if you have a fragile situation coming from the past, you're more open to these new influences, such as unemployment, such as especially male unemployment, such as poor schools, and so on, such as ghettoization and violence. And that is the single most important internal factor. Now, the state, very often, let me say, I'm accused of being conservative because I emphasize this. It's nothing of the sort. But I'm guilty of guilt by association here, because conservatives do emphasize this factor. What they tend to do is to say, well, look, I mean, this problem of single parenting is, I mean, racism has nothing to do with that. It's their choice. So we have nothing to do with it. So let the state wash its hands of it. No, no, no. If it is true that this originates in centuries of state-sanctioned slavery and state-sanctioned Jim Crow, and as you've written so poignantly about sort of unfair imprisonment of men and so on, the state has a major responsibility in repairing this to the degree that it can. And it can be repaired, because one of the points I emphasize in the cultural matrix is To say that something has a historical and cultural background is not to say that it can't be fixed. Culture is not immutable, which is one reason why liberals don't like cultural explanation. They say, oh, you're saying it's cultural, therefore you're saying it's their fault, therefore nothing you can do about it. No, let me give you some dramatic examples of culture changing quite significantly. Right here in the South, Jim Crow, an institution that was built up over centuries, was dismantled rather within a few decades. Just think about that. But think about an even more dramatic recent example, the attitude towards gay marriage. Was it one of the justices in the Supreme Court, as they struggle with this now, is saying, look, this thing has existed for millennia, and we're wanting to change something, but we see right under our eyes within the past decade, a set of attitudes that are built up over thousands of years changing. So culture can change. And with the right support from the social and economic forces and legal forces. And that's where I come back to the view that my explanations are never purely cultural, because culture exists always within a context. If it's reinforced by the social context, it will persist. And in that sense, single parenting will persist if it's reinforced by the social and economic environment which neglects it.
But you're also acknowledging very much so, this emphasizing this interplay between the two.
Yes.
But so when we try to, since we want to look to the future as well, so the question then comes back to not just what's the explanation for the situation we're in today, but where should the emphasis be in terms of going forward? And what you were just talking about would suggest that it is the role of the state to intervene in terms of a single mother needs some kind of support that makes it where she can be a better parent. But
it's both. It's both. Because I do think, and I've emphasized, and in the last chapter of the book, when I go through all the ways in which the government can be helpful, I also point out that African Americans have had one great revolution, the Civil Rights Revolution, which addressed the external problems, successfully. That perhaps they should think about an internal revolution, which address how their role in fixing the problem.
We have this perception of that one of the big problems in African American communities in the past, always teen pregnancy was an oft brought up factor, and yet that's something that while the teen pregnancy among African American girls is actually declining dramatically, hugely. And overall for the country, it's fallen by almost 50%. And so it's almost like what we're seeing is an evolution of what it means to be a single parent, and it's something that isn't as debilitating as perhaps it once was.
Well, look, let's get into that, shall we? It's complex, but I think we should clear it up, because one of the things I hear being said a lot is the number of white women who are having kids out of wedlock is as great as when Moynihan wrote in the 60s, the mid-60s, pointing. The percentage is the same as it was among blacks and so on. Ergo, this is a problem which is not distinctive. We're comparing our apples with pineapples here, okay? And and that's why I keep referring to the Scandinavian situation, because the white situation is more like a Scandinavian situation. That is to say, most white women who end up as single parents become so as a result of divorce. That is to say, the kids are born with the parents either cohabiting or getting married afterwards. Most of them, too, who get divorced, remarry. White Americans have a problem with staying married, but they do love to get married, and so they stay married. Again, the fathers involved recognize kids and support them to a much greater degree. In fact, you have a lot of custodial battles as to who's going to keep the kids. So it's a different situation. The kids, white kids, end up growing up, if not with their biological parent, often with a two-parent stable situation with support. I often say it's not out of wedlock, which is the problem, but out of bedrock. Kids need a bedrock of stability of at least a couple of adults, whoever they may be. This is not the case with the Black American community, okay? Most of the kids are born out of wedlock, to say, in which the parents are no longer together. And that remains the case.
So does that mean then, to have what you just said, does that then suggest that a Bill Cosby response of a decade ago, the it's time for Black America to confront these moral problems, these issues with its constitutional fiber, does that suggest that that's where the core problem relies in America?
He oversimplified, and but it is an issue. The question is how we solve the problem. Whether the solution is that African Americans adopt the marital patterns of white Americans or not is questionable, because there was a policy, a program, in which over $300 million was spent by the Bush administration, the Healthy Families Program, I don't know if you know about it, which was designed to do just that. It was a failed cultural policy, if you like, in which African Americans were to be encouraged, coached into proper marriage and so on. It didn't work. There's one exception, I think, I forget what state, but it was by and large a failure. In fact, one of the chapters in this book explores in depth, because I was very interested in that. And so I look at all policy options and say, how did the Bush policy option work? It didn't work. In fact, not only did it fail, but in one case, that of Baltimore, it turns out that when these inner city people were taken in and coached and so on, they went back home and said, well, so this is what a healthy family is supposed to be like. Well, we don't have one, and split. You know, it had a very opposite of the what is intended. So that's not going to work. I don't know. My position, it may be a cop-out, is that I'd rather leave it to the wisdom of the African American crowd, if you like, as to what solution is going to emerge. Do we have a solution in which a single woman is strongly supported by others, or even though they don't get married? I don't know what the solution is. In the same way that one didn't know what the civil rights solution was going to be until Martin Luther King and the Southern Christian group and the other groups develop it. But it is a problem which should be recognized. But let's not just emphasize that, because there are other problems in the African American community, internal problems, to some extent partly derived from this, but also derived from ghettoization. And that is and that relates to the problem of how the police got involved, which is the violence within the inner city communities.
We certainly have had, over this past year, the interplay between the police and African Americans in the inner city, and this larger debate about mass incarceration, this larger debate about the ferocity of police enforcement in recent years. All of these things come together. In the past year, in the post-Ferguson debate, the behavior of police has been a real focus of all this, and I think you would argue that has probably been overemphasized and not enough attention to the behavior of, as in the case of Ferguson, where in the end it turned out that the young African-American man was
Yeah, it's both, and we have to understand why. And we need to go back to how this originated, because it's been around for some time. It's exploded in public knowledge and consciousness now. But Black Americans have been suffering this for a long time, and we have to understand how it originated, what happened. This goes back to the early 70s, history again. And the growth in violence, especially in the inner cities, as a result of drug addiction and gangs. And here's a great irony of how this thing originated. The emphasis on law and order, the emphasis on incarceration, and on draconian laws. Began in New York, one of the most liberal states in the nation, under a liberal Republican, as Rockefeller, who introduced the first really harsh set of laws and the emphasis on incarceration for drug crimes. Now, Rockefeller, when he introduced this series of really draconian laws, I mean, the liberal community in New York saw what the consequences would be and were extremely critical very critical. To whom did Rockefeller turn for support in passing these laws? He turned to the black leaders in New York, especially in Harlem, who came out in force. And there's a book coming out soon on this by Mike Fortner called Black Silent Majority, which explores this in great detail. How on earth did we get into this situation where America became the country, this is most draconian laws, mass incarceration. What happened was that Rockefeller got the full support of the black community because they were catching hell. They were terrorized by what was happening in Harlem and other inner city communities. Massive increase in drug addiction, heroin at that time. This is before the crack epidemic, and gang violence. And they wanted relief. They weren't getting it. Because we had an earlier period, which originated in the South, in which black crime was not really paid much attention. They wanted protection. We're citizens. We deserve protection. So they supported him. And it was with their support that those laws got through. Because if they had come out strongly against it, it wouldn't have gone through. Now talk about unintended consequences. Although, the liberal community saw the consequences. But what happened was that we shifted towards then this draconian emphasis, this law and order emphasis, which the right then picked up, and the black community for a long time continued to support, because even in the 80s we then had the crack epidemic, and it was living in a state of siege in the inner cities. One cannot neglect that, and people are neglecting this.
Yeah, and it's often forgotten today that as recently as the early 1990s, if you look back at the polling, that African Americans overwhelmingly supported three strikes you're out, these very draconian measures. Yeah.
And they did so, unfortunately, given the consequences. More importantly, instead of focusing on this relatively small minority of inner city youth who are creating the problem, the result of the years of neglect and all the rest of it, without fathers, gangs, and so on, they then began to generalize and profile the entire black community. And as we emphasize, and especially my long chapter, African Americans in the inner cities and out are among the most law-abiding group of people in America. They're also the most God-fearing and church-going group of people in America. This is the 80% of black Americans who are the ones who are calling for police protection. But instead of getting police protection, they got police abuse. So there you have, in a nutshell, what the problem is. They generalize it. They disrespected the entire black community. So the black community found itself between a rock and a hard place, a rock of police brutality and a hard place of the minority of disconnected gang-based youth with their violence. And instead of being protected, they found themselves, being disrespected by the police and living in an environment which was really, hellish.
Well, and this brings us back to, I think, part of the tension between some of your interpretation of things and some other experts, and that is that we have this overwhelming support with all Americans, and certainly among African Americans, because they see the existential threat of rising crime in the 70s and 80s and 90s. And in fact, Attorney General Holder tells the story of when he was the U.S. Attorney in Washington, of going out to a housing project in Washington, D.C., and meeting with the Tenants Association and saying, we've got a bunch of ideas about programs to try to divert young men away from prison and try to avoid sending them away. And all the little old ladies who were in the Tenants Association said, all of whom were black, said, well, that all sounds great, sounds good, do whatever you can to help the kids out. But before you leave tonight, will you go ahead and arrest all the guys who are sitting on the front step of my apartment? And so there was this among those who felt most threatened, there was strong support for this. But now, 20 years have gone by in which crime rates have plummeted for whatever reason, perhaps the one you were suggesting earlier. But so arguably, black behavior has changed quite dramatically. It's actually done what you would say, Bill Cosby would say, should have happened. That there's been great change in the much less crime being committed by this population of folks. And yet it is a structural thing, structural element of society in terms of the police and the government that is still behaving as if it was 1990.
As it was 1990. And it's changed. The crime rate has gone down quite substantially, as several people, ourselves, have pointed out, but it still is leveled off at a catastrophic rate, I'm afraid. The murder rate is 8 times the national average still. the inner cities.
Among African Americans, yeah.
Yeah,
Right.
in fact, within the inner cities, it's even greater, the rates. It's more like 10 times. And what's more, the bad news is that it's beginning to increase again among teenagers, okay, since 2002. So it depends on what, you can emphasize the decline, which is good, which criminologists have had a hell of a time explaining. We're not quite sure why. But you should point out, for those of us who work in the inner cities, that it is still the case that there is a sense of living on the siege. Girls have got to be locked up inside, that you're terrified every time your kid goes out.
So what should happen then? So given what you just said.
There are several things that should happen. One of them is not very popular, but it's been in the news again. If ghettoization is part of the problem, and living in cramped spaces with bad school and in which kids are sort of, can't emphasize this point enough, kids have got to have adult supervision. As a species, that's the way we are. We differ from other species in the sense that our head is too big, so that when we're born, it's still ill-formed. It's still too small, and it grows. It's growing right through teenage years and so on.
I have an 18-year-old, so I've learned this with very direct experience.
What it means is that we need constant attention growing up. If kids don't get that, you have problems.
In the 1990s, you had, during the Clinton years and a bit beyond that, you had several things that happened, some of them more deliberate than others, but through the Hope 6 program, almost all the public housing projects, particularly in urban areas away from the Northeast, but tremendous numbers of public housing complexes were demolished and then reconstructed as in a very different way with dramatically fewer people. Yeah. And so you had a displacement. They also typically didn't allow many men back in because if a mother and children, but anyone with any kind of criminal record couldn't come back in. But nonetheless, that seemed to disperse a lot of troubled populations in ways that some of the predicted negative consequences of that, where are these displaced folks who've been involved in bad behavior in the past are just going to be bad in another place. But instead, they sort of disappeared. But then the other thing was welfare reform. And then the third thing was, even though now it has a bad name, through the Bank Community Reinvestment Act, you had banks compelled to finally give loans to a lot of poor people, many of whom couldn't then pay them back, and that led to the recession, or was a part of the recession in 2008. Nonetheless, you had tremendous growth of very modest income neighborhoods that African Americans moved into, and there was this great dispersal, and that coincided with the fall in crime.
Yeah. Yes, it did, and that's to be noted. But let's emphasize another factor, which is African American men and the problems they face, because one of the factors explaining the low rates of partnership, I won't say marriage necessarily, but partnership, is the shortage of available men in the African American community. And that is due to several factors. One is the higher rate of unemployment among them. So even if they're available, they don't necessarily make, from the women's point of view, ideal spouses. And, but also the extremely high rate of incarceration. And one in three African Americans in their 30s have had a prison record. That is, that is obscene. That is outrageous. I mean, we're supposed to be the leaders of the free world, and we incarcerate our people at a higher rate than any other nation in the history of the world. This is true, especially of blacks. It's also true of whites.
Yeah, 25% of all prisoners in the world are here. Right?
So, and that has created a situation in which there is a tremendous shortage of men. But more importantly, it was a totally counterproductive policy, because it actually worsened crime. Because you bring in a lot of nonviolent people who are in the wrong place at the wrong time, drug arrests and so on. You bring them into prison with hardened criminals, they end up being violent when they come out. So we, fortunately, one of the few areas of agreement in divided Washington now is the fact that this was a disaster. And even all the Republican candidates, including even Cruz, is saying that we've got to reduce the prison population for various reasons. hopefully something will be done there.
Yeah. But so you also have been pretty critical of, over time, specifically of hip hop when we talk about the black culture end of things. Tell us about that.
No, I should correct that. I'm critical of one genre, subgenre of hip hop, the gangster hip hop. And I think hip hop is phenomenal. It's one of the areas, as you know, the great majority of people who consume hip hop are middle class and upper middle class white kids, as well as the rest of the world. And we have a long chapter in our book on hip hop. Now, so again, I want to emphasize, no, I'm not anti-hip hop. I think it's just extraordinary that out of the South Bronx, that you should have had such a remarkable movement. And good hip hop, which is most hip hop, is lyrically and musically quite innovative, and is another example of how African Americans have had a disproportionate influence out of all relation to their numbers. But something happened to hip hop, and you'll be amazed at what the source of the problem is. The gangster rap, which emerged in the 90s mainly, which emphasize the violence, which emphasize to get their street creds. Quite very often they're claiming to be bad in a way in which they weren't. If you investigate these singers, it turns out that many of them came from good working class families and are claiming to be doing all kind of wicked things, which the opposite was the case. They were scared to death when they were young. Now, how did gangster rap become the dominant genre? It turns out that it was encouraged by the corporate interests who had taken over or the financial control of hip hop. They were actively encouraged to emphasize the violence and so on, because they claimed this sold, especially to white audiences. So I want to emphasize that. Furthermore, hip hop is not what caused the problem. It was largely reflecting it, although by focusing more and more on the gangster rap, the thug culture, it may have, at any rate, given too much encouragement to those who are originally inclined to be that way in a way. So let me just make that absolutely clear. There has been, however, recent changes in hip hop, which I think are very encouraging, as younger group of singers have moved in that direction. So as with everything else, it's complex. No, I'm not anti-hip hop.
And there's not something unique to hip hop. Like I say, I was going to read to you some Katy Perry lyrics of recent times about last Friday night, stranger in my bed, pounding in my head, menage a trois, streaking in the park, and that's not. But so there's nothing unique to hip hop. It's
youth culture, popular music, and all over the world, and not just this genre.
So the broader question I'd ask you about that is, if we go a little further back in time, if we go back to 1900, and as you know, poverty statistics only go back a certain amount of time in American life that are meaningful. But it appears to be generally agreed that in 1900, a little more than 50% of Americans lived in what we would call poverty today, though probably a much worse version of poverty than today. And so by definition, that would mean that African Americans were probably, their numbers were north of the 90s. Yeah, probably 95% poverty probably among African Americans.
Oh, absolutely. And we have studies by the great Du Bois.
Exactly, that's our best data. Exactly, exactly. And so, but so something happens between 1900 and we go through the gang crisis of Bonnie and Clyde in the 30s, and we get into the 40s and a different kind of gang crisis, but similar kinds of issues facing poor whites.
Yes.
But something dramatically different begins to occur. Culture changes in some manner. White culture looked bad in 1900, begins to look a lot better by the 50s and 60s. So in the end, if we just look back historically, was it institutional remedies, or was it something in the hearts and minds and souls of God-fearing white people? What was it that brought about this gigantic change?
Oh, simple. The economic lot improved considerably with the assistance of the state. Ira Katznelson has a great book, When Affirmative Action Was White, in which he traced in great detail the ways in which the state assisted whites in getting out of poverty, both the state at the federal level and at the local level, and it varies with different ethnic groups. So with the Irish, we know that city government was a critical factor in the Irish getting out from the ghettos and their violence and so on. Later on, of course, we know that the federal government, well, there was this sort of great welfare reform of the 30s, but also the GI Bill, and which basically created the suburbs with massive state support. All of this happened with the deliberate exclusion of black Americans. And repeatedly, in the case of the welfare reforms under Roosevelt, you know, eventually it came to benefit African Americans, of course, but it's significant that excluded from the benefits were domestic workers and agricultural workers. In terms
of minimum wage, Social Security, and all that. Exactly.
Okay, so blacks were deliberately excluded. But in the case of the invention, creation, support of the rise of the suburbs by the federal government, you had redlining and all the other set of factors in the building of ghettos which deliberately excluded blacks from this. Now this is important to know that so the federal government was not only important and complicit, I should say, in creating segregation and in excluding blacks, but that this had an accumulative effect. It's cumulative in that if your great-grandparents have money and property, the probability of you having property is greatly enhanced because it's passed down. One of the important ways in which blacks are disadvantaged is not only in income, but even more importantly, in assets, in wealth. This is much greater than the income difference. And I think the average white American now has a household income of well over $100,000 in, not income, assets. Sorry, of over 100,000. For the average black, it's something like 8,000.
Yeah, it's 10 times higher
10
or more.
times higher.
Right.
Now, but this is cumulative. So you can show that what happened in 1900. In fact, there's a recent study by a group of economists who looked at a program which helped a group of whites, mainly, in the early part of the 20th century. And then they moved forward over 100 years to see what the descendants, they were able to track the outcome. And amazingly, the consequences lived on. So, you know, you want to buy a house, I mean, your parents will help you inherit your parents' home and so on. So that was a major factor. So that's one reason why I say the state was complicit in the problems of African American, going back to the legalizing of slavery, going back to the laws which returned slaves to Virginia or wherever, going back to the policies in the in the welfare program, in the GI Bill, in the building of the ghettos, and therefore the state has a major responsibility in solving these problems.
Yeah,
not to mention that it's good for America.
Yeah, and so by all that calculation, you get to a place where, in the 1960s, when you first start doing the body of your work, the poverty rate of African Americans at that point was not quite the 50% number nationally, though in much of the geography of the country it would have been well north of that.
Sure.
So in many cases, the 1960s are for African Americans, even 1970 is for African Americans what 1900 was for white Americans.
For white Americans, yeah.
And so we've got this 70-year gap. Exactly. And so the shorthand of the structuralist versus culturalist argument is that a culturalist is more likely to say that structural fixes, like the war on poverty, which now the effects of which are so widely disputed now, but one would say that a culturalist isn't going to say that a structural remedy like the war on poverty or other programs is central. But you would, obviously, in the intermarriage,
because there's interaction. So people respond to disadvantage in the best ways they can, and they develop attitudes and so on and so on, which then, while they may be functional at the time, later have deleterious consequences. And I said, single parenting, to get back to that, is in part reinforced by the fact that, men have such low income or no income, and they feel they cannot meet their responsibilities as fathers and so on. That's one of the factors. But if you do that generation after generation, after a while the thing becomes normative. So, you have to see how culture and structure continue to reinforce each other. And so I'm not a pessimist. You said the conservative position is it's the culture. And the culture is nothing we can do about. We weren't involved in creating it, and there's nothing you can do economically about it.
It's just on black people.
That is simply wrong. And, and as I said, I keep pointing, people can change their attitudes. And we see some change, for example, in the dramatic decline among African American youth in the teen pregnancy rate, which has gone down significantly. That was as a result of a lot of attention being paid to the problem, and various effort made to educate African American young women, in particular, which they'd emphasize males in this, but and it did have an effect. The rates were cut substantially. But that's one sort of problem. While the rate of teen pregnancy has gone down significantly, indicating that we can do things, the rate of single parenting, nonetheless, did not go down. So it's complex.
It is. And, let me ask you one last question. So as we head into this presidential election, and having worked through all of this with the fascinating dissection of how we got here. But so if you were sitting here with some months from now and it's either Hillary Clinton or Rand Paul or Ted Cruz, who I guess is your man, but you were sitting with whichever of those figures will be the next president, and you only had a minute to give them a prescription for how to move to the next phase of American life, one in which Fergusons are less likely and Baltimores are less likely. What's that prescription that you would offer them? Okay,
on the police, well, first of all, on the incarceration rate, America has got to get out of the embarrassing situation it is now. There's got to be a substantial reduction in incarceration. That we've got to make major changes in police training, that the police have got to learn to stop profiling the entire black community, that they've got to respect the inner city community as a whole and see their role not as an occupying force, but as there for protection, not just to respond to crime, but to prevent crime, and therefore, community policing and so on. I'd strongly emphasize that. I'd also emphasize the need to reinforce all the programs which have been shown to work, such as childcare, Head Start, the strong emphasis on after-school care, and growing programs such as which will initiate youth into job training, and all of which have been worked. The nurse partnership program, which is a very interesting one, which sort of helps inner city mothers in training. And this would be the emphasis on charter schools at work, because one of the big problems in the inner city is the poor schooling and so on. And basically continuing a set of programs which the present president has started under the My Brother's Keepers program, which coordinates all the successful program and in fact incorporates business people in helping in both men in terms of providing good role models, training and jobs and so on. That would be what I'd strongly emphasize.
And what would your advice to them be what would the message be that they should convey to African Americans?
They should convey to African Americans that they are integral members of this community, that the state was responsible for many of the problems that African Americans face over many hundreds of years, and that the state will partner with the African American community. As the African American community itself takes on the responsibility of how it can make the changes internally, which it will have to make, but with the strong support of the state, as indicated by the more advanced sort of European countries, which have shown in Scandinavia, for example, how you do this. And so a partnership in which both African Americans take the responsibility for changes internally, but with the strong assistance of the state.
Harvard sociologist Orlando Patterson, has been a treat to have the benefit of your mind for the past hour. The book is The Cultural Matrix, Understanding Black Youth. Send us a comment about this program, to download a podcast of this or other episodes, or to read a transcript. Visit us at millercenter.org, where American Forum is available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. I'm Doug Blackman. See you next time. That was great.